Hey everybody, how are you guys doing? I'm Eric Airlock, and this is a third and final talk laying out my theories about Aristotle and Alice. Please see the previous two videos in particular. Please see my videos about Aristotle, logic, Alice, Chinese and Indian logic, and a bunch of other things. Please check all that out, my website and YouTube channel. But with all of that, and I will work a bunch of stuff into chapters so it is more digestible. I am giving the longer version of a talk that I am thankful and honored to have given to the Lewis Carroll Society of North America, in which I lay out, and I have laid out in the previous two talks I just recorded, that I believe that Aristotle's 10 logical categories lay out point by point the events and characters of Wonderland, and then the Looking Glass mirrors that. And it is backwards, upwards, from passion to substance, past time and space, which play pivotal roles. So this now, in the previous two videos were about Wonderland and the categories of Aristotle, and then the Looking Glass and the categories of Aristotle. This is about the hunting of the Snark, and then my final thoughts on the four forms of proposition corners of the square of opposition. Those correspond to the four syllogisms of Aristotle, forms of argument people study. That's basic to ancient Aristotelian, but also modern logic, the kind I believe Lewis Carroll was mocking at the Mad Tea Party. And so this is now a talk here about the hunting of the Snark, and how I think that following two books that do contain, in my believes, good word that, I'm making up, I'm talking purty one day, and hopefully tomorrow's. So, following Alice's adventures, getting on here with the talk, in the hunting of the Snark, there are 10 characters who have no names other than their professions, jobs which all mysteriously start with the letter B. The bellman, boots, bonnet maker, barrister, broker, billiard maker, banker, beaver, butcher, and baker, as listed in the beginning. And I do not believe that the order that I've been painstakingly, let's hope, instead, pointing out in Wonderland and the Looking Glass is not in the same order, is actually quite mixed up, because this is intended a bit, I think, as a logic problem in which each of these 10 stand for one of the 10 of the categories of Aristotle. Again, all of this could be, in certain ways, it can be all kinds of other things, all interwoven here, all kinds of thinking. Politics, art, poetry, religion, everything. If it's culture, it could be in here. But I think he was teaching people. My whole extended argument here, of course, has been that he is teaching people the categories of Aristotle, and then I will follow this hunting of the Snark theory about that this is a logic problem, which would make sense because he printed nonfiction works on logic problems and syllogistic reasoning. That this is going to lead to then theories about the categories and then balance with ethics and Aristotle. So in his game of logic, Carroll used similarly B-word things, buns, babies, beetles, and battledores, which is a badminton racket, as his examples of individual things, also known as beings. I do think that silly pun is possible here. That there are many beings like this and that and that. He says these are individual things. He does not say that these B words are beings himself right there, but he says they're things, and he likes B words. And that, again, seems to have a pun with it easily. And those would be substances for Aristotle. That would be his highest of the 10. Anything that's actually existing is of some substance. And of course, Aristotle actually thought that of, it seems, the gods, spirits, and other things that he did believe in. In fact, Aristotle does speak as if he believes polytheistic gods of other tribes that aren't his gods or what have you are real. He does speak in this way a couple of times. So again, substantive being of any kind for Aristotle, whatever's in the cosmos. So Carroll likewise used baked, beautiful, black, and broken as his, a little unfortunate, examples of attributes. What Aristotle categorized as qualities, as we had with the last. In Carroll's introduction, he sarcastically says, Alice's adventures show us that as their author, he is incapable of nonsense, though they instead, of course, show how capable of sense and nonsense he is. That he says, well, obviously I couldn't joke around, given my last couple of books, which means he's serious about, well, comedy is a serious business, isn't it? So he is speaking duplicitously. And that in this new, brief, but instructive poem, that this, quote, includes precise arithmetic truth and natural history, which are words that apply all of it to Aristotle's categories, but also the work of Aristotle on logic and Aristotle's work as a whole. Precise arithmetic truth and natural history would in a certain way be the 4 forms of proposition and the 10 categories of Aristotle somewhat, because arithmetic truth is the logic, natural history would be the physics, the cosmology, the categories, what we can say about things as the things. Now, Aristotle, of course, has a lot of works that would more so be what somebody could call natural history, but even putting things of the categories in the organon of Aristotle into Alice et al. In the work, if I am right at all about that, would be including arithmetic truth and natural history. That is a playful way of referring to what Aristotle very much does in his work, as anyone who knows Aristotle would know. So if Aristotle's 10 types of being fit the 10 who work jobs that start with B, which is not far off from possible, and are thus being each of their own way on the hunt, and of course he's already had animals that die or live by their titles with the insects on the train and the looking glass. So these 10 who are beings are being as their professions with no other name. So they are being how they are being, and their activities and their occupations are who they are. It is certainly possible that the hunting of the Snark works like a logic puzzle, like the very sort that Carroll designed using tables in his work on logic, in the game of logic and then symbolic logic. And we can solve the puzzle by assigning each character an Aristotelian category. There is evidence from cover to cover, including the images on the front and back covers, that the bellman, the first character of the story, the captain of the ship and the leader of the adventurous hunt, is Time. And I am thankful I did not get to meet Giuliano, who's active in the Lewis Carroll Society, in this meeting, but I wish him well, and I am thankful for his work. I am also thankful, again, for the work of Gardner, Burstein, many others of the Lewis Carroll Society, Christopher Morgan and others who have helped me, and I'm very appreciative to the society as a whole. And it is particularly, they asked me about the Wasp and the Wig, which they would, and I'm glad they did, because they were instrumental in coming out with the Wasp and the Wig, and I do still stand by my theory, because I think that my theory does present that as something of absence and substance in the end of the tale, but I'll just leave that at that. That it would have screwed up the numbers of the categories if making them 13, but then again, he hadn't written the other book to correspond to anything yet, had he? So with all of that, Giuliano was pretty notable in his work from 96 of pointing out that the bellman is Father Time and carries a school bell, and he definitely has an alarm clock to one of the characters waking him. I think the barrister from his dream of a pig, actually, which is like somewhat the Duchess's house. So, using that insight, definitely, I have mentioned, it was that had me thinking, well, the caterpillar is time and the Cheshire Cat is space, and that is largely what led me to this comprehensive whole theory, of which I have parts I have yet to describe, the parts that need to be more so filled in, but I am confident enough to suggest it is also possible that this is something worthy of either that or something like it consideration. That there is all the evidence of Father Time is very much the bellman. So the bellman is Time. Well, that takes care of the bellman, doesn't it? I mean, if you are creating the clue-like logic grid, which is exactly the sort of thing Lewis Carroll was having his students of logic do, or at least those reading his entertaining works, it seems, of nonfiction about logic, that already crosses Time off the list as the bellman, doesn't it? I mean, you can check that entirely down off the board for everybody else, right? So, if that's Time, it does seem, let's just start with that, and this does not go in order. I don't argue that this goes in the same backwards inverse order as the first two. I think it's mixed up like a logic problem, which does make some sense. It is not the same preserved order as the first. It would... I mean, I don't know if I would like it or, I mean, I wouldn't not like it if nobody got it so far. But he does not, I think, list the names of these jobs. I think he says bellman, boots, bonnet maker in that order, and that does not correspond to the order that I suggest is there, that backwards order of Aristotle in the Alice Adventures, the two books. But if the bellman is time, with a finger in everyone's hair, you can also then, which hair grows with time, and you actually see him with his finger on that front piece. And one of the folks in the conference showed that image with Bellman, the small banker, who I argue is state. And he's a tiny little guy, and Time is standing over him with his hand twirling playfully kind of in his hair, but clearly the superior. It looks like Time is our superior, and this particular state, at least, is not permanent, you know what I mean, or is dwarfed considerably. You can see that in the image. And again, if that is somewhat the banker, again, that is not hard to understand if it's Time versus the banker, you know what I mean? Whatever you bank over time, or more or less. But with all of that, if the bellman is Time with a finger in everyone's hair, I think the best way of working this out, and I think some of these are mentioned so barely that I think the evidence that is mentioned with them does fit the theory, and then we barely have any evidence of them because Carroll actually focuses on only a small number of the hunters. So we actually have comprehensive evidence of the baker, I would say, that he is substance. That's very much throughout in a lot of ways, which is cool. But we barely, I think, hear much about the boots, but I would say that the boots is likely place, which would make sense. Your boots are where you're placed. Who knows the rudder is backwards because of place or placement of the rudder. That could also be arguably position. Boots could arguably be position. But next, I would argue, is that. But he knows the rudder is backwards, and he sharpens a spade for digging in a spot, which again, place and position, Aristotle himself admits these categories are not absolutely exclusive. They are confusing, and that's exactly what makes it confusing that Aristotle lays out these categories. But again, if Carroll is playing with the list, he can dance all over, and I think he does, how these are not completely exclusive, and yet he could assign each one. So I think that it is, if you have to say which one is which, I think the better candidate and boots could be a good candidate for place with the sharpening of a spade for digging. The maker of bonnets and hoods for birth and death would very much be position, especially if we're carefully reading the Alice books and we note that Alice worries about birth and death and positions of old age and being young, specifically in the rabbit's house, in the white rabbit's house, which would be position, I believe, for in Wonderland, in position in the Looking Glass, in the corresponding numerical chapter, seems to be about being in position going round and round uselessly in the woods with Tweedledum and Dee, and contrary-wise in logic positions. So there is something about birth and death in Tweedledum and Dee, but it definitely clicks very well with some of what Alice reasons to herself in the rabbit's house about bonnets and hoods for birth and death. In fact, hoods has a nice sort of death-like meaning. And that was mentioned by others. I got that insight I am pulling from other scholars, and I thank them for that. That is not my original idea, that bonnets seem to be, and hoods seem to resemble birth and death. I don't know specifically whom to thank, but there you have it. So, who is positioned on the hull of the ship and creates an arrangement of bows to award success. That's another piece of evidence. The maker of bonnets and hoods creates an arrangement of bows for the occasion. Well, an arrangement of bows could just be a meaningless decoration. It also could be an award for gaining a position of, and it's more of we would often describe something of distinction as a position that gained rather than a place gained, but, it could be back and forth a bit, and these are confusing, I will admit. But again, there's a lot of evidence here that ties some of these to some moments of Wonderland, of course. There seems to be a lot of strange crossover. I think that strange crossover is reflecting the categories, and I'm letting that guide, of course, my decision-making and reasoning here, but I don't have to strain very much to make this fit. I hope you can see. Of course, I am practiced in this and worked on it, but it did fall very much into place without me trying hard, and it should, especially if Carroll thought a child could find it at all. And I think that it's like what Poe says, and what Carroll admired of Poe and he told people about of Poe, is that if you hide something simple in things and work backwards, you can look like a genius and be just as intelligent as anybody, and that's wonderful. That's actually quite beautiful that we can do that. The genius is glimpses of the obvious, so hide something backwards in something, and then they can glimpse what was obvious and think you a genius. Yeah. So Alice does ponder the positions of old and young as she sits crammed into the White Rabbit's house and is assuming the whole position. And next, the barrister, who dreams of a pig on trial and does a lot of wildness with that, definitely seems bad at and is involved in relations. And of course, relations, again, is confusing with place and position. These are all interrelated and confusing. Aristotle does not do the perfect job of talking this all systematically out, as I've already mentioned a couple of times. But the barrister tries to prepare the beaver by citing cases. Well, cases would be situations of relations between this or that person in the court, and that they have a certain this or that they have to work out, of cases of relations between, folks involved in each trial. Again, a lot of this stuff applies to everything under the sun, but it does. The pig appears in the house of the Duchess, who is poor at relations and seems to be sharing space with space, as I mentioned. And so the barrister, all of these characters are bad at relations and somewhat silly people, not fully real in their behavior. If they are ideal categories, that would make a bit of sense. And so that seems to be the best crossover for relations. Now, the broker, we are told the broker values the goods, and that is some of all we hear, and that he sharpens the spade with the boots. We actually hear the spade is sharpened with the boots when we're hearing about the broker. Now, that would suggest that he values the goods. That would be quality of value, and he sharpens the spade, and the sharper the spade, the better for digging, so he improves the quality of the spade. With the boots, who is using the spade for place. So sharpening the spade is better quality for digging in place in a specific spot. The billiard maker, we barely learn about the billiard maker at all, but the billiard maker is involved in games. Now, that also could be relation or something like it, or position. Yes, because billiard players and or makers, I suppose he fashions and might not play, but that would be strange, wouldn't it? Who chalks his own nose as if he is a tool for playing the game. He chalks his own nose and he makes, I guess, himself somewhat into a cue. That seems like he is a tool for action at most base. Action plays a very central role in Wonderland and the Looking Glass. Action is, if I am at all correct about any of this, and I would like to hear people's... Obviously, if people do believe the theory and they think I'm off about a substitution or two, I would be very interested in talking it out and not aggressively debating, but at least, supporting my position and seeing what they have to weigh against it, which I would, certainly encourage and want people to think more and invest more into these texts, definitely, by this. That we barely learn about the billiard maker, but I think because he chalks his own nose getting ready to do something, that would be action. It's a bit the corkscrew of the other tales. And the cue is not a corkscrew, but a bit, pushy forward. As is a spade, though. The banker who writes a check for England. We're actually specifically told he writes a check for England, and I've already mentioned Father Time is standing there with his finger in the States, lowly, kind of sad hair, if you look at the, his neck and position of his head. Definitely seems like it reminds me, I was thinking of Confucius earlier, and apparently he says, politicians today, those puny creatures aren't worth mentioning. And it is, again, if you look at that image of the banker, I believe, who has the telescope, he writes the check for England. He immediately writes a check for England. Well, that would very much associate him with state. And the bank, state bank or not, I'm not the British banking historian in the slightest, but he carries a telescope, and that's mentioned by the ticket taker. The telescope corresponds in Alice, in the Looking Glass, to the train. Well, I happen to argue that and this is one, I have to say, if several pieces click together, that's exactly what I'm looking for, and I hope for confirmation. So, if he's carrying a telescope, you look over the Alice books for a telescope, like you're looking, and that's the material that's available. Bark and dog, sure the cats love that. Outside, though, safely out the door. So I hope the cats know. in some kind of way. That the check for England is state. He carries a telescope mentioned by the ticket taker with Alice on the stately train, and then he writes a check for England. If I'm right about the train at all, that is state, and corresponds to the caucus race of Wonderland, well, then there's two things here, the telescope and the writing the check for England, that would correspond. First with check for England is in himself state, and carrying the telescope corresponds with state in Looking Glass. The beaver, now the beaver would be, what character in Wonderland would one immediately associate the beaver who paces nervously on the deck and knits lace? Well, one of the first characters I would think of is the White Rabbit. If you have an animal, and a passionate animal, who passionately paces on the deck and knits lace, well, passion bonds us with things, and there is something here where, because he is knitting, it is, and I did consider, is he time, like the sheep who knits? That is possible here. But I think it is also knitting lace is interconnection, which is passion interconnects us. And there is evidence of passion interconnecting in the Alice places where passion is in the beginning, where the White Rabbit is all confused and is man and beast. And then Alice is a-tangling with the kitten she loves and hates alternatively, it seems, and is all tangled up with her own emotions and the kitten and the yarn ball and all of that. So he's knitting lace, and there's the yarn ball of the black kitten. I do think the black kitten and the White Rabbit both are passion in either book of Alice. So the beaver who paces on the deck and knits lace is passion, the character most like the White Rabbit. It does seem, and there is other things about him in the book that does seem to identify with him being emotional. And the butcher who carves things up, dresses too formally, and teaches the beaver sums is quantity, making the beaver much the passionate child, learning sums from the elder mathematician of quantity. The butcher, and think about how almost Lewis Carroll it is that the butcher is a mathematician and a quantity maker of sorts, yes? He also is a little bit kind of like the White Knight in ways. He dresses too formally, somewhat absurdly, and he teaches the beaver sums, which is a bit more like the Queen's, of course, is teaching Alice sums. But I do think, in an interesting way, that the White Knight being a bit Carroll, and then Alice being, well, Alice, as well as other children, and the White Knight playfully sort of teaching Alice, many have mentioned, it does seem a bit of Carroll in the White Knight, a bit, who is in a bit writing himself in there as an oldened character who is nice to and kind to Alice. It does ring a little bit, and it matches a little bit with the butcher who teaches the beaver a bit of math in an overly active way, Anglo-Saxon attitudes indeed. And the beaver is delighted with this little bit of math that's overcomplicated. And it makes the beaver much the passionate child learning sums in a way very much put in the position of Alice. And Alice is much the position of the White Rabbit a bit herself, and then dreams and follows the rabbit. So the rabbit is plenty like Alice, the White Rabbit, in Wonderland in the beginning. And the beaver here seems a bit like the White Rabbit and a bit like a child over-delighted at learning math and logic, which would put Carroll a little violently and dangerously as the butcher. But then again, I actually do think he somewhat puts himself in the position of the walrus, at least in The Carpenter, and consumes the attention of children on the beach and sees such violence as metaphorical sometimes, and is not actually is playfully suggesting violence to children, which he does all the time. I don't think he actually intended that, with overextended Anglo-Saxon or Victorian attitudes to mean that he wanted to be, a butcher of children, but I think he has playfully suggested violence and, history, let's call it, to children all the time. Foremost and finally, the baker who leaves everything on the beach, wears many layers, bakes bride's cake, doesn't lie, is roused by muffins, mustard, and jam. That's several different substances. He bakes bride's cake, which is sweet substance. He wears many layers. I mentioned not the White King, the King of Hearts in Wonderland wears a crown on his wig, on himself, all uncomfortably. The baker wears many layers. I do think the King of Hearts is very much substance in the Trial of Tarts. So he resembles the King of Hearts a bit, and with many layers. He bakes bride cake, which is a sweet substance like the Trial of Tarts. He doesn't lie, which he cannot tell a lie. Whether or not that's true of George Washington, that is very much not true of the mock turtle and the Griffin and the mock turtle together, who lie a lot, and then they lead Alice from that lack of substance to the trial of Tarts and the king. So with all of that, he is roused by muffins, mustard, and jam. He forgets his specific name. Well, if he's all of substance, he in a certain sense wouldn't have a specific name as all of it. It wouldn't be of a specific type. And he fades away as mortal material substance does without a trace in the end, which many, of course, say is a bit existential end of death. But I do think that actually, if you read this with Aristotle's categories, the hunting of the Snark is about facing the uncertainty of mortality and of being a substantive mortal creature. But I think Carroll believed that substance is mortal, passing with time, which is huge in my argument of these stories. Endurance over time is key. A bit of a golden key here, a lot. But that's space and time and perspective and all of it, I think. The temperance for perspective, the time for the spaces, it seems. That with all of that, passing time between positions of birth and death, bonnets and hoods, like all human ambitions, but unlike, in a certain sense, I think, the human soul, which Carroll believed was capable of a kind of golden immortality in the golden beyond, whether or not any you or I or others do or don't believe in, say, Victorian, Anglican Christianity, high conservative or broad progressive, and Carroll says he was sitting on the fence about both. He definitely believes there is something of a golden beyond, and in his schoolboy work about Aristotle, he says Aristotle missed it, and he implies and could safely mock Aristotle as such because Aristotle was a polytheist and wasn't a Christian, so he could safely win an award for a piece in which he mocked Aristotle for not getting what is certainly beyond substance, which he did in his earlier work. Doesn't mean he kept exactly those beliefs, but he felt safe. It certainly seems in the evidence of his early work, he felt safe insulting Aristotle from a Christian perspective in Victorian England. A bit, criticizing him a bit as not fully in line with Christian beliefs of that time and culture. That does seem highly arguable given the work, not just because this kind of person would be likely to, but because he does in his text. I do believe he is far more critically engaging with the work of Aristotle throughout all of these works, and he is only incidentally dealing with the work of Boole, which he is kind of new and a little bit still heretical modernity at the time of his still all too classical education and teachings, which he would teach people Aristotle and other classics, but not teach people necessarily ideas of Boole so much. At first, it becomes more symbolic in his later work, as that kind of logic is increasingly catching on. In Britain and Germany, in particular. And France as well. So after the baker vanishes, they don't find a button, feather, or mark, any substance as evidence, as substance himself has vanished away. If so, the Snark hunt as a whole definitely suggests material being is confusing in space and time for us partial mortals, and yet there is the solid beyond substance that cannot be named nor categorized. What Carroll believed is golden, but past Aristotle and the intertangled categories. All right, so that said, I could go on, but I actually, in talking this out, almost have hit a half hour because I kept my slower pace and I decided to take my time and fully explain all the details that I did round off in the original planning of the talk. So I'm going to cap this video here and stop this here, and then I'm going to go on and make a shorter video. This was not a shorter video as I planned. I got to talking, but that's the talk. Or at least it can be now. So Aristotle's four forms of proposition and the rulers of Alice's two dreams, and then the white daisy chains and red falling leaves, which is the ways that I think the second major idea of Aristotle, the four forms of proposition, which, if you know Aristotelian logic, is basically the part of Boole, that the part of Aristotle Boole preserves, and the part of Aristotle Lewis Carroll uses most in his syllogistic logic puzzles and riddles and game of logic, that I think that it is highly arguable that those four forms of proposition are hidden in the royal characters of Wonderland and the Looking Glass. I do not know where and how they figure in the Snark. I do think they might. I don't have yet theories how. I will try to look into that more. I didn't want to force everything, or try to have a theory about everything, because I found enough and enough popped together for me in these ways that I didn't try to force that. So I do think there are, and I would be very interested in people's thoughts on which of the hunters of the Snark or what suggests, and it would probably be found in some of the images as well a bit, of the illustrations Carroll did, take a decent hold over. Now we'll talk about, in the next talk here, the four forms of proposition, the royals, and I'll talk that out again slowly. It will still take less time than a half hour, I'm sure. And then finish here with the white and red, and also black and gold. Aristotle may not use gold consistently to mean balance, but golden mean and golden rule, with the golden key, etc., does suggest in golden afternoon, and the opening of the Snark does start with gold as well, that there's a lot of golden balance, and then there is white and red as opposite kinds of extreme child and adult that you're supposed to avoid in navigating the course between the two. It definitely seems the Alice books and the images of the Queen suggest that, so I will follow this with a video about my theories of the four forms of proposition, which is significant, I think, in the work, and would be for Carroll. But then also finish with the color significance, which has to do with what I think is some of the most impressively Wittgensteinian part of Carroll's work, which is how emotional states are basic to logic and human reasoning, which is a subject I have a lot of thoughts about, and I will share those as I share my work on Wittgenstein and my understanding of his work, which I learned from good people at Berkeley. And I do intend on fleshing out more for myself and others in videos. So, much happiness, much love. I will, again, continue with my theories on Aristotle in another video. And as always, I hope you are, well, both good and bad, or else you are likely dead and not hearing this. But I will see you, if I ever do see you.